Okay, so it's Valentine's Day, the day that we celebrate romance and love. But a lot of young people in my country, and you're talking to me from England, in your country, they are not having either of those things. 38% of Gen Z reports that they're not having sex, which is unbelievable. 73% report feeling alone sometimes or always. And I think like the big headline is that we're living through a breakdown in romance and in sexual relations and maybe even in the ability to love that's happening. And I'm going to just be pretty hetero in this conversation because most people are, between men and women. Broadly speaking, diagnose the problem for us. Explain to us how that breakdown happened.
We have had a lot of societal change in a really short period of time. And some of that is ideological, but most of it, and I'd say the ideology is also coming from this, is actually to do with technological change. I mean, the pill is basically like the big thing that I'm interested in this book. But it's not just the pill. It's the internet, it's, it's domestic and international migration, which is enabled by the aeroplane. Like basically we've had this enormous technological change to the way that humans have lived forever that has occurred in the last, let's say, 200 years post-industrial revolution, and that's really accelerated in the digital era. And I think that what it's done is it's kind of shredded our social institutions. It's obviously brought a lot of comfort and affluence and convenience and all sorts of things that I celebrate and everyone celebrates, but it has also led to a lot of dislocation. And, the example that I always think of when it comes to sexual relationships is, and this really affects Gen Z, it turns out, right, that people left to their own devices, young people, actually find it really, really hard to find life partners. It turns out that it's a really difficult coordination effort to meet the right person at the right moment, for them to be a suitable partner, for you to, get hitched in the right way, start a family, all this stuff, this like sequence of events that needs to happen at the right time is actually really hard. I mean, like I've been with my husband for over 10 years and we both look back and we're like, how did we get so lucky? We just basically bumped into each other and it kind of worked out. There isn't really a template now, not as such. It's kind of an improvisation, I think. Whereas in the past, and indeed in other cultures, my first degree was in anthropology, so I always come at this with a kind of the mind of the anthropologist and thinking, what is it about us that makes us different from other cultures? And other cultures invariably have much more formal ways of doing things in terms of matchmaking young people and getting them married and getting them starting families, and we don't. And in some ways that's good, right? It does mean that the outlier people, the unusual people, can be experimental and can have more freedom and can have more options, and that's really good for them. But I think for most people, actually, it just produces a degree of passivity and almost flailing. I think that that's so much of what we see actually among young people now. There's a kind of there's this profound uncertainty, and we see that in the data.
Well, one of the things that's maybe a paradox is never before in human history has it seemed easier to meet people, right? Like, we don't rely on the village matchmaker. We all have these little machines in our pockets that allow us to download hundreds of different dating and sex apps that presumably, at least on the surface, should make this whole mating and dating thing so much easier, but the opposite seems to have happened. Why is that? Is it that there's simply too much choice? And how do you think for young people, especially trying to navigate this, they should be relating to those apps?
So I'm sure part of it is too much choice. It's like that thing where you log on to Netflix to watch something and you're just like,
you end up scrolling forever.
Yeah, and then you're like, I'm just giving up. This is, I'm sure there's a psychological process there, I think. I think it's also to do with some innate differences between men and women, which are quite hard to reconcile. There is an extent to which I don't want to overplay the battle of the sexes, because actually men and women are completely capable, and frequently I look in my own life and the lives of others, men and women can have the most beautiful, loving, lifelong relationships, right? But there is also an extent to which male preferences and female preferences are a little bit at odds. and come into tension in certain settings, and not least in dating, right? So not the biological clock would be one example. Women's fertility window is shorter than men's fertility window, and that, ask any woman in her 30s who's trying to find a man, that's a really difficult problem to solve, because men feel as if they have all the time in the world, and women really don't feel that way, right? And so there's an inherent tension there where it's in the interests of a lot of men to play the field for as long as they can, and that's not in the interest of a woman who's, say, in her early 30s, right, and is starting to get worried about her eggs. When there are no established rules, and not least, right, and I know that this is a controversial issue, when premarital sex is completely normalized, women's leverage is reduced.
Dramatically.
Yeah. And it does become the case that if you're a high status man and you're attractive and you do really well on the apps, which is true for a minority of men, you don't have to do really anything that women ask of you, right? Because there's like an endless supply of new women available, and there is no stigma attached to leading them on, right?
Well, there's all of these interesting studies that show that there's a tiny percentage of men that basically get all of the women on the apps, and then all of the rest of the men are sort of left with nobody.
Yeah, and are miserable about it. And look, the thing is, it is the case, I think, it is certainly the case that back in the day when you couldn't have premarital sex, and when the expectation was that you would get married and you would have children, and it was rare to not do so, there were women who probably felt as if they'd kind of settled and felt like they were married to men who were, dissatisfying in various ways. Like, I think that we have to face up to that. That clearly was the case. Having said that, I do wonder if our very, very modern conception of what marriages ought to be like is in a sense unhealthy. There's this, Eli Finkel wrote this book called The All or Nothing Marriage some years ago. It's a great book about the stages of marriage in terms of looking at American history specifically. And he kind of modeled it on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So when you're living in a society which is very strained materially, say you're living on the frontier, right, in 19th century America, really your priority
is living.
Yeah, so you want a partner who can like chop wood for you, grow food for you. You know what I mean? Like it's very much a union of survival. And of course of reproduction, and then allowing your children to survive as well. But then as society becomes more comfortable, more affluent, people start to actually expect more from their marriages, and they think, well, maybe I also want someone who's actually kind of fun to be around. Maybe I want someone who I have a real romantic connection with. And you get to the point now in 21st century America and other parts of the West where actually we expect so much from our marriages. We don't just expect them to be economic and practical unions. We expect them to be sites of self-development and of authenticity, all this stuff, which frankly, some marriages can meet that threshold, but most can't.
Hey guys, Barry here. I hope you enjoyed that clip from the latest episode of Honestly. If you want to watch the full conversation and support the work that we do here at the Free Press of fearless, independent journalism, subscribe today at the top link in this video's description, or just go to thefp.com/join.